Okay, imagine this. What if your brain had like a unique ID tag, a neural fingerprint that's just you?
Right.
And then what if you could take something that temporarily scrambles that tag? So for a little while, your brain patterns look, well, surprisingly like anyone else's.
Uh-huh.
And echoes of that change stick around for weeks.
It sounds pretty wild, doesn't it? But yeah, some really cutting-edge neuroscience is suggesting that's kind of what happens with psilocybin, the compound in magic mushrooms.
Yep.
These new studies are pointing to this really profound but temporary shakeup of our unique brain signatures.
And that is exactly what we're getting into today. We've gathered a bunch of sources, some really key studies, expert takes, context on the brain science to really unpack this whole idea.
Yeah, try and make sense of it.
What is this neural fingerprint? What's psilocybin actually doing to it? And, what could all this mean for things like mental health or even how we understand consciousness?
Our plan is to, well, walk you through the science, pull out the main insights, and help you see why these discoveries about temporary brain shifts might actually matter quite a bit to you. So let's dive in.
All right, so first up, this whole concept of a neural fingerprint. When the sources talk about that, what are we actually dealing with?
So basically, it's the unique way your brain is wired and how different parts communicate. The specific pattern of connections and activity across all your brain networks.
Okay.
It's not really about your thoughts at the moment or specific memories, but more the underlying plumbing of how signals flow. And normally that pattern is super stable and really unique to you.
And the sources mentioned they use fMRI to see this. Is that right?
Yeah, mostly. Functional MRI, fMRI, that's the main tool. It tracks brain activity by looking at blood flow changes.
Right.
And that lets researchers map out functional connectivity, basically, seeing which brain regions are sort of firing in sync over time, like listening to see which parts of an orchestra are playing together.
Okay, I get that analogy.
And scientists have found these patterns are so distinct, they can actually pick out individuals just from their fMRI scans with really high accuracy. It's a solid, unique signature for your brain.
Okay, stable, unique identifier. Got it. Now, this is where the science from sources like the Nature Study Siegel and colleagues 2024 gets really wild. What did they actually see happening to this fingerprint during the psilocybin experience?
Yeah, this is where things get dramatic. During the main effects of psilocybin, that really organized, unique brain fingerprint, it gets massively disrupted, way beyond just normal day-to-day fluctuations.
Massively disrupted. How, what does that look like in the brain scans?
The main thing is desynchronization. You know those brain networks that usually work together in predictable ways? Especially the default mode network, the DMN, that's the one involved in self-reflection, planning, mind wandering, our sense of self.
Right, the ego network, some call it.
Exactly. That network and others start to lose their usual coordination. It's like the conductor walks out and the different sections of the orchestra fall out of sync.
And what does that do to the unique fingerprint?
Well, it basically gets masked. It's drowned out. With all this desynchronization and the usual patterns breaking down, the things that make your fingerprint yours just aren't clear anymore.
Huh.
The sources use some pretty striking language, like brains on psilocybin look more similar to each other than to their untripping selves. Your individual neural ID is sort of temporarily wiped out.
Wow.
One study even said they could not be identified until they finished their trip, just based on these brain patterns.
Okay, temporarily wiped out. So is it just complete chaos in there, neural anarchy?
It's not really chaos in a bad way. It's more like, well, this state of desynchronization leads to what scientists call higher entropy in the brain.
Entropy.
And I think of entropy here as more randomness, maybe more unpredictability in the signals, a greater variety of connections being explored. It's shifting from a very ordered, maybe rigid state to something looser, less constrained. It's not broken. It's like unlocking a different, wider operating mode.
Yeah.
And that state might actually be crucial for breaking out of rigid thinking patterns.
And is there a connection between this vanishing brain ID and what people actually feel during the trip?
Oh, absolutely. The sources draw a really strong line there. This temporary loss of the brain's unique pattern, the desynchronization, especially in those self-related networks like the DMN.
Yeah.
It correlates very strongly with the subjective stuff people report, ego dissolution, that feeling of losing your sense of self. It really seems like the brain's identity tag dissolving maps onto the feeling of the self dissolving.
Okay, that makes sense. So the Siegel study points towards brains becoming less distinct, more similar overall.
Okay.
But didn't one of the sources you looked at mention a study that seemed to find the opposite?
Yes. This is where it gets really interesting and nuanced. Another line of research, mentioned in some sources work by Amico and others, sometimes connected to Tolley's analysis, found that psilocybin seemed to make these functional brain patterns, the connectomes, more idiosyncratic.
More idiosyncratic, so
Ugh.
more unique. How does
Yeah.
that work? That sounds like a flat-out contradiction.
Right, it does at first glance. But the way the sources try to reconcile this is by suggesting they might be looking at slightly different things or different levels of detail.
Okay.
So the Siegel study sees the big picture. The usual features that make your baseline fingerprints stand out get disrupted, they get drowned out. And on that level, brains look more similar.
Uh-huh.
But the Amico Tolley angle might be picking up on something more subtle. Like even within that state of higher entropy and desynchronization, the specific way your brain is scrambling, the way it's reshuffling connections. Maybe that pattern of disruption is still uniquely yours.
Ah, okay. So while the main ID tag disappears, maybe the style of the scrambling is still personal, like a fingerprint written in the chaos itself.
That's a pretty good way to put it, yeah. It suggests that even in this really disrupted state, it's not just random noise everywhere.
Right.
And importantly, even with all these changes going on, researchers still find links. Specific shifts, like changes in the DMN, still correlate with parts of the subjective experience, like feelings of oceanic boundlessness, awe, unity, that kind of thing.
Fascinating. Okay, so that covers the really intense part, the trip itself.
Mm-hmm.
But you said the story doesn't stop there. Your sources suggest these changes hang around after the main effects wear off.
Yeah, and this is maybe one of the most important bits for the therapeutic side. The brain doesn't just, snap right back to normal the second the trip ends.
Right.
That Nature study actually tracked brain connectivity for weeks afterwards. And while most patterns did return to baseline fairly quick, like within days,
Yeah?
they found certain connections stayed altered for longer.
Which one specifically? What lingered?
One connection that stood out was between the anterior hippocampus that's involved in memory, learning, emotion, and both the default mode network and the wider cortex. There was a reduced connection there.
Accurate connection.
And that specific reduction stuck around for up to 3 weeks after the session.
3 weeks. Wow. So what's the brain like during that period? What does that feel like, potentially?
Well, the researchers describe it as a looser, maybe more flexible state compared to how things were before the psilocybin. That specific hippocampus DMN link eventually did normalize, usually fully back to baseline around 6 months later.
6 months, okay.
But that temporary weeks-long window of changed connectivity, especially between emotional processing and those self-networks, seems really significant.
And does this lingering flexibility connect to that idea that the sources mentioned, the neurological reset?
Exactly. That's the metaphor researchers are using, a neurological reset. It captures the idea that psilocybin doesn't just shake things up temporarily. It seems to induce a state of enhanced malleability, increased plasticity.
So it's not like breaking the hardware, but more like hitting pause on the usual programming, making it easier to install updates.
That's a really good analogy, actually. These theoretical ideas mentioned, like rebus or rebus.
Relaxed beliefs under psychedelics.
Yeah, that one. The core idea is that the higher entropy, the desynchronization, it allows the brain to rely less on its old ingrained habits and assumptions, those rigid thought patterns that can really trap people in depression or anxiety.
Uh-huh.
It seems to create this window where the brain is just more open to exploring new ways of thinking, feeling, connecting ideas. And that acute disruption, the fingerprint masking we talked about, that seems to be what kicks off this period of flexibility that follows.
Okay, so if the brain enters this more flexible reset state, especially for weeks afterwards,
Yeah.
why should I, as the listener, really care about these specific brain changes? What's the bottom line?
Well, this is where we connect it directly to the promise of psilocybin for mental health. By disrupting those often negative, rigid, self-focused patterns heavily linked to the DMN and other networks in conditions like depression, OCD, addiction, psilocybin seems to create this window of opportunity.
An opportunity to build something new.
Exactly. It seems to make the brain more receptive to forming new, maybe healthier neural pathways. The sources point to some really compelling clinical trials showing rapid symptom relief and, crucially, sustained relief for severe depression, anxiety, addiction.
Right, I've seen some of those headlines.
Yeah, and sometimes this relief lasts for months, even over a year after just 1 or 2 sessions, provided they're done with therapeutic support.
So how would a therapist actually use this knowledge?
That period of enhanced brain flexibility, those weeks after a session, that's seen as absolutely key. It's often called the golden window for integration work.
Integration.
Yeah. Therapists can help people process the insights they gain during the experience and actively work on cementing new perspectives, new habits, new coping skills, while the brain is literally more plastic, more ready to form those new connections.
This research about the brain changes. It brings up a really big question, doesn't it? Is the actual
Yeah.
subjective psychedelic experience, the trip, the visuals, the ego dissolution feelings, is that necessary for the therapeutic effects? Or could you potentially get the brain benefits without the, well, journey?
That's probably one of the biggest debates right now and a huge area of research. But the evidence we have from these sources suggests there's a pretty strong link.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the studies consistently show significant correlations between how intense people rate their subjective experience, especially things like that oceanic boundlessness scale, which covers awe, unity, ego loss,
Uh-huh.
and positive long-term outcomes like reduced depression scores or shifts in negative beliefs about themselves.
So the feeling itself might be part of the healing mechanism, not just a side effect.
It definitely looks plausible from the data. I mean, the acute brain changes we talked about, the DMN disruption, the fingerprint masking, they correlate with those subjective feelings. And it's all happening through the same main pathway, the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor, which is also implicated in the downstream plasticity effects.
Right.
So yeah, it raises real questions about whether you could just design a drug that hits the receptor but skips the subjective experience and still get the same profound reset and the same lasting benefits. The trip might actually be integral to unlocking that potential for change.
Okay, this is all incredibly exciting, but the sources are also pretty clear about adding some important caveats, some cautions. This is still early days, science-wise, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Super important to remember the limitations here. A lot of these key studies, especially the very early ones, have pretty small sample sizes.
Like how small?
Well, that core analysis showing the fingerprint effect in the Nature paper, based on data from just 6 or 7 people. Now, other analyses in that paper and other studies like the Amico one had more, maybe around 46 participants, but still, we need bigger studies.
And often they're done in healthy volunteers, not necessarily people with the conditions they hope to treat.
Correct. We need more large, well-designed trials, specifically in clinical populations, and placebo control is genuinely tricky. It's kind of hard to hide a full psychedelic dose from someone.
Yeah, I imagine.
Plus, we really need more long-term data looking beyond just 6 months or a year to really understand how durable these effects are.
The sources also really hammer home that it's not just about the drug itself. The context is huge.
Massively important. That's the whole set and setting concept. Your mindset going in, what you expect, the environment you're in, who's with you, trained guides are crucial. All of that profoundly shapes the experience and the outcome. The sources even point out that just having someone focus on a task during the session can actually reduce some of that brain desynchronization. It shows how much the context and your intention influence the brain's response. Skilled guidance isn't just nice to have, it seems essential.
And the language we use matters too, right? Avoiding hype.
Yes, exactly. The scientific terms desynchronization, network disruption, increased entropy, masking the fingerprint, they describe functional changes. It's really not accurate or helpful to use sensational words like obliterates the brain or suggest it's causing permanent damage.
Got it.
The change is clearly profound and it's temporary. It's about function, about flexibility, not about destruction.
Okay. So switching gears slightly. For someone listening who's maybe interested in leveraging these kinds of insights for, say, cognitive flexibility or personal growth, maybe not through psychedelics right now, how does this research inform other approaches?
Well, the research really frames psilocybin as a potent tool, right? But the underlying principles it highlights about breaking rigid patterns, about entering these periods of increased malleability, those ideas have broader relevance. The sources emphasize the strategies that were part of the successful studies.
Like having support and setting an intention.
Absolutely. Having support like the trained monitors in the studies and going in with a clear intention, knowing what you hope to explore or work on, that seems key. And maybe most critically, the period after any kind of intense, mind-altering experience.
That golden window again?
Exactly. Whether it's chemically induced or maybe achieved through other deep practices, That following period of potentially enhanced plasticity is where the integration work really happens. That's the time to actively build new habits, reinforce new perspectives, maybe dive into mindfulness or creative projects. The brain seems more receptive to making those changes stick.
What about microdosing? Some people talk about that for flexibility. Does this research touch on that?
Yeah, the sources generally note that microdosing uses much, much lower doses. Doses that don't seem to cause this really profound, widespread desynchronization or the temporary wiping out of the fingerprint that we see with higher doses.
So different mechanism.
It seems like the effects are much subtler, likely working through different or less intense mechanisms. If the goal is this kind of dramatic temporary reset followed by a significant plasticity window, this specific research points towards a full macrodose experience done under the right conditions.
And are there ways to explore brain flexibility without any compounds at all?
Sure. The sources briefly touch on it. Practices like deep meditation, certain types of breath work, or even getting into intense creative flow states, these can also nudge the brain towards greater flexibility and different states of awareness.
Right.
Generally, probably not to the same degree of acute disruption or temporary pattern change seen with a high dose of psilocybin, but they are definitely valid paths for cultivating mental flexibility over time.
Okay, so let's try and bring this all together. What's the core takeaway, the main message from your deep dive into these sources on psilocybin and the neural fingerprint?
I think the key insight is that psilocybin induces this really profound, but temporary shift in the brain. It moves it from its usual, highly unique, ordered state to a more flexible, less predictable one. It does this by desynchronizing key networks, like the DMN, and essentially masking that individual neural fingerprint for a time. And critically, this isn't seen as damage, but as a functional change, a change that seems to create a window of enhanced neuroplasticity, which might allow the brain to break free from deeply ingrained, unhelpful patterns. And this whole process appears fundamentally linked to its therapeutic promise, and maybe even tied to the subjective experience itself.
It's clearly a powerful mechanism.
Yep.
Really highlights how dynamic our brains can be, but also something that obviously requires careful understanding and, well, responsible application if it's ever used more widely.
Absolutely. The research is really just starting to scratch the surface of how this all works, but it's showing us that even seemingly stable parts of our neural identity can be temporarily dissolved, potentially opening the door for significant healing and change.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. In temporarily dissolving the unique patterns that help define your mind can lead to such significant shifts, such deep healing. What does that tell us about the nature of identity itself, about consciousness, and maybe about the potential locked within our own brains that we rarely, if ever, access? Something to think about.